All right, so I'm going to be going over the AP Literature essay rubrics. And so, starting with the poetry analysis, this seems to still be the essay that people have the most trouble with because it has to do with poetry. But there are only certain things that you're looking for to be able to score well on the rubric. And so, looking first at this row A, thesis, you don't get any points at all if you don't have a defensible thesis, or the intended thesis only restates the prompt. So you don't want to do that thing that teachers tell you when you're younger, which is that your thesis is just restating the prompt. You don't want to do that on the AP exam or in college. The intended thesis provides a summary of the issues with no apparent or coherent claim. So this is where you will see lots of times when I'm conferencing with you, I just say it's all plot summary. In order for it to be a thesis, we have to have the possibility of an argument or a disagreement here. If it's just a fact, it's not a thesis. It just is exactly what's happening, and there's nothing to kind of debate. It's that level one thing. We can point right at the text and say, this is for sure happening. There's no interpretation necessary. And the last is that there is a thesis, but you're not responding to the prompt. So you're writing your essay on something different. And then you get a point if it's responding to the prompt and it has a defensible interpretation of the poem. So again, we need to be in that level 2-3 realm where we're interpreting, we're reading between the lines, we're looking at what the author is doing here, that's creating this, whatever they're asking you to look at, the setting, the character, how the author's creating those things. So then below, it just, in case you need further clarification, it has some things here that you can look at. The additional notes, the only things I want to mention here is that it can be more than one sentence. So a thesis, oftentimes people say it's the last sentence of your first paragraph. In the AP exam, because it's a timed exam, your thesis might be your whole intro paragraph, that's it, that's the starting of it. It also can be anywhere within the response. So in the AP exam, they're looking to reward you for what you do well. So even if you don't get to your thesis until the very end of your essay, you'll still get a point for having your thesis if it meets the criteria above. I, however, suggest that you spend more time planning so that your thesis can be at the beginning, because when we go to look at the next steps, if you don't have a thesis in mind at the very beginning, chances are your evidence is not matching up with that. Chances are it's not going to get any of the sophistication points or any of the possible sophistication things necessary for getting that last point. You need to be building off that. So I often suggest taking the poem shouldn't take that long to read, but you should annotate it while you're reading it, so you should be looking for things. If you read the prompt and you see, okay, this is what they want me to look for, then as you read the poem, you should be looking for those things and annotating as you go. So that's already a form of outlining it. And then you should come up with your thesis and come up with what you're going to quote. So it's a very simple outline, but it's just thesis and then point 1, point 2, however many points you have. It doesn't have to be a 5-paragraph essay, so it might just be 2 points or 1 point, but with kind of subcategories to it. And then what you're using to defend that point. And so that is your outline. And reading it and doing the outline might take you 15 minutes or so, but then you already have that completely set up. So when you go to write, it doesn't matter that you've used 15 of your 40 minutes because you know where you're going and you're hyper focused in on what you're writing about, and that's going to sound better. Also, you don't have to spend 40 minutes on each essay. So I would look through the prompts initially, figure out which one you feel strongest, you think you can do the best job on, and do that one first, so that at least one of your essays is really, really strong. And then the other two, you'll still obviously spend time on them. But if you end up spending, an hour on the first one, then that's okay if that one is going to receive all the marks and that's going to be really good. And then you split your remaining time between the other two. So just kind of a side tangent, but I personally don't like to see your thesis just randomly somewhere else in your paper, but you will get credit for it if it is there. And you can get the thesis point even if the rest of it doesn't fit with your thesis. And so that's kind of what I was talking about. If you don't arrive to your thesis until the end, maybe the rest of your paper doesn't fit back with your thesis. You can still get the thesis point, but that's only 1 point. So you're not going to do well if you just get 1 point. Okay, next, in row B, it's evidence and commentary. So there are various levels that they're looking for here to be able to qualify this, or like where this fits in how well written your essay is. So 0 points, you just restate the thesis, if there even is a thesis, and it repeats the provided information, or the information is irrelevant to the prompt. So essentially you're just writing the prompt, or you're not even writing about the prompt, but you're not using evidence or commentary to add to your thesis at all. So oftentimes this is incoherent, it might be really short, it might just be your opinion, it could have no textual evidence at all, or it could just be completely incorrect. It's okay to misread something in your interpretation, but you better be able to back up your interpretation of it. That's what interpretation means. But if you can't back up what you're saying, then it doesn't count. So to get 1 point, you provide evidence that's mostly general. So they're not really specific quotes being used. It's just kind of using plot summary, or in the case of poems, like it's still essentially plot, but just specific emotions and things, but not actually looking at the text. You're not really using the actual pieces of the text. And then your commentary summarizes your evidence, but it doesn't explain how this supports your argument. So you might say that this poem is about friendship, and that can be seen in many lines in the poem, but then you don't tie it back to the commentary, or like your thesis doesn't tie the commentary back to the thesis with the idea that friendship is something that's long-lasting, strong, whatever your thesis is. But like you're not going further than just being like, yeah, this poem's about friendship, it's about friends. So it tends to focus on summary of the poem, not specific details, and definitely not specific techniques being used. You might throw in some literary devices. You might say metaphor and simile, but you're not explaining how they're used. You're just saying stuff like, this poem has metaphors about friendship. Okay, so what? You need to have more than that. But you can get a point for that. To get 2 points, you're providing some specific relevant evidence. So you are using some quotes in here. You are making sure that there's evidence to back up your point. And you explain how some of it relates to your argument, but there's not a line of reasoning that's established, or your reasoning is faulty. So this comes into that. You need to be able to back up what you're saying. Otherwise, if you're wrong, you're just wrong. So it's specific evidence and then broad generalities. It might be simplistic or inaccurate. It could also be repetitive. This is what I see most often, is you just kind of make the same point over and over again, but there's nothing really new. You make one point well, but you don't make multiple points, or you don't support those claims adequately, and you don't explain the connection or progression between your claim and your line of reasoning. So that's 2 points. 3 points is you provide specific evidence to support all the claims in the line of reasoning. So you have multiple points here. Your commentary explains how some of the evidence supports your line of reasoning. And it also explains how at least one literary element or technique in the poem contributes to its meaning. So this is, most people starting out are going to fall somewhere in the 0 to 2 points here, depending how much plot summary they use. But for 3, we're starting to actually look at how those literary devices are being used. So what that there's a simile about friendship? Why use a simile? Why have that comparison? What is that comparison doing, and how does it impact the reader? So looking at specifically what the writer is doing with those elements, with those techniques, and how it's tying back to the poem and creating this piece of literature. And then 4, it's specific evidence to support all of your claims. And also it consistently explains the evidence and how it ties back to the thesis. And it explains how multiple literary elements or techniques contribute to the meaning. So this is like the best of the best as far as everything tying back in. You have everything you need. There's no questions left over at the end. And the organization here is really strong from point to point. You don't lose them at any point. The additional notes here is if you have lots of grammatical or mechanical errors that interfere with communication, it can't get to that 4. So you're going to be stuck in the 3. So technically, grammar and stuff isn't held against you. But if it's making your meaning unclear, then it's not going to have the really well organized part you need to get into a 4. And then to earn the 4th point in this row, the response may observe multiple instances of the same literary element or technique if each instance further contributes to the meaning of the poem. So maybe the poem has 5 similes in it, but you're talking about how specifically each one adds upon the next, and maybe you're even looking at why there are 5. So why does this one exist? Why does this one exist? How do they all tie together? Etc. And then the last point is a point that I don't want you to focus on. I want you to focus on having a very strong thesis. I want you to focus on having all of your evidence tie back to those things. And then this last one is the sophistication point. And this is a lot harder to get. So when they change the rubrics around, these rubrics are easier to know where you fall. But this is the 9. This is the cream of the crop. This is, you read this essay and you're just like, I can't believe someone wrote this on a time limit. So you get the point by demonstrating sophistication of thought and or develops a complex literary argument. So there are things that they have that you could get it is identifying and exploring complexities of tension within the poem, illuminating the student's interpretation by situating within a broader context. So that's that level 3 idea. So how does this fit into society, into a criticism of things going on in the world? Accounting for alternative interpretations in the poem. So if you have counterclaims throughout, and then employing a style that's consistently vivid and persuasive. The problem with trying to focus on this last point is that it's very easy to fall into the 0 points. So attempting to contextualize, only hinting at other possible interpretations, making a single statement about how interpretations of the poem comment on something thematic without consistently maintaining that thematic interpretation, oversimplifying the complexities in the poem, use complicated or complex sentences or language that is ineffective because it doesn't enhance the student's argument. So if you're just mentioning, like, this poem on friendship is actually looking at how a society that focuses on individualism makes it hard for people to have meaningful connections. If you just say that, well, it's still a 0. You have to consistently keep returning to that point to be able to get the sophistication point. So I don't want you focusing on this, because if you can get the 5 other points, that's really good. So making sure you have a thesis, making sure you're supporting everything with evidence, that it flows from point to point, that you're explaining the how and the why in all things, is far more important than focusing on this last point. If you can get this last point, awesome. But if you're trying to get this point and you let the other things kind of fall to pieces, then it's not worth it. So you really want to focus on the first 5 points, and then this point will either come or it won't come after you've mastered the other part. So that is the poem rubric. I will be going over the other rubrics in a later video.